The morning of July 2nd, 1955, began like any other at New York's Idlewild Airport. The sun cast long golden streaks across the tarmac as passengers bustled through the terminal, their suitcases rolling noisily over the polished floors. At Gate 14, the departure area for Flight 914, travelers waited for their call to board. Some chatted excitedly about their upcoming vacations, while others sat quietly, engrossed in newspapers or sipping coffee from steaming cups. The air was thick with the scent of jet fuel, a familiar aroma that signaled adventure for some and routine business for others. Flight 914, a Douglas DC-4 airliner, was bound for Miami, Florida. It was scheduled for a short 3-hour journey, a routine trip that the airline had operated countless times before. The aircraft was in pristine condition, having undergone routine maintenance just 2 days prior. The 57 passengers aboard were a mix of families heading to Miami's sandy beaches, businessmen traveling for meetings, and elderly couples seeking the warmth of Florida sun. At the helm was Captain John Patterson, a highly experienced pilot with over 20 years in the cockpit. A man known for his precision and professionalism, he exuded confidence as he stepped into the aircraft's flight deck, adjusting his cap before settling into his seat. His co-pilot, First Officer Ronald McGregor, went over the flight plan, confirming weather conditions with air traffic control. Everything was in order, clear skies, minimal turbulence expected. It was shaping up to be an uneventful flight. At exactly 9:55 a.m., the flight crew received clearance for takeoff. The aircraft rumbled down the runway, its 4 massive engines roaring as the DC-4 lifted into the bright blue sky. From the airport terminal, a few onlookers watched as the plane climbed higher, disappearing beyond the scattered clouds. For the first hour, everything proceeded as planned. Flight 914 cruised at 20,000 feet, smoothly slicing through the sky. The flight attendants moved up and down the aisle, offering refreshments and ensuring passengers were comfortable. Captain Patterson exchanged light conversation with his co-pilot, remarking on how perfect the weather was for flying. But then, something changed. At exactly 10:42 a.m., Miami Air Traffic Control lost contact with Flight 914. One moment, the aircraft appeared on their radar, progressing steadily along its planned course. The next, it was gone, vanished without a trace. Controllers immediately attempted to re-establish communication. Flight 914, this is Miami Tower. Do you read me? Static. They tried again. No response. Panic set in as the minutes stretched into an hour. Controllers scanned the radar frantically, hoping for even a fleeting blip to confirm the aircraft's location. There was nothing. It was as if Flight 914 had ceased to exist. Emergency procedures were initiated. Search and rescue teams were dispatched to scan the ocean and land along the aircraft's expected flight path. Military jets were scrambled to check the skies. The possibility of an emergency landing was considered, but no distress signal had been sent. Days passed and then weeks. No wreckage was found. Not a single piece of debris washed up on any shoreline. No signals were detected from the aircraft's emergency transponders. Authorities scoured reports of any unscheduled landings, any possible sightings, nothing. The families of the 57 passengers and 4 crew members were left in a state of anguish. The airline could provide no answers, only speculation. Had Flight 914 suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure midair? Had it been hijacked? Had it somehow veered so far off course that the search teams were looking in the wrong place? By the end of the year, with no evidence to support any theory, the investigation reached a dead end. Flight 914 was officially declared lost, presumably having crashed into the Atlantic Ocean. Death certificates were issued for all on board, and the world moved on, accepting that some mysteries remain unsolved. But the story of Flight 914 was far from over. For decades, Flight 914 remained nothing more than an eerie aviation mystery, a tragic yet forgotten footnote in the long history of air travel. The families of the passengers had grieved, the authorities had moved on, and the world had accepted that the aircraft had been lost to the depths of the ocean. But then, something happened, something that defied logic, science, and every known law of time and space. On the morning of September 9th, 1992, a quiet day at the Caracas International Airport in Venezuela was suddenly interrupted by an unexpected transmission. Caracas Tower, this is. There was a brief pause before the voice continued, laced with confusion. Flight 914. Requesting landing clearance. Over. The air traffic controllers in the tower froze. The call sign, Flight 914, didn't exist in their system. And yet, a faint blip had appeared on their radar, approaching from the north at a moderate speed. The controller on duty, Manuel Torres, hesitated for a moment before responding. Flight 914, please confirm your departure location and scheduled arrival. Over. Static filled the radio for several seconds before the voice returned, now slightly anxious. Departure New York, scheduled arrival Miami. What's the delay here? Towers? Torres felt his blood run cold. That flight path didn't make sense. New York to Miami was nowhere near Venezuela. But more importantly, Flight 914 had disappeared 37 years ago. Thinking it had to be some kind of prank, he remained professional. Flight 914, confirm your departure date and aircraft type. Another pause. Then, the voice responded, sounding irritated. We departed July 2nd, 1955. Douglas, DC-4. Requesting immediate landing instructions. Torres's heart pounded. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. But when he grabbed a pair of binoculars and scanned the runway, his breath caught in his throat. There, in the distance, approaching for landing, was an old, propeller-driven Douglas DC-4. The aircraft looked exactly as it would have in the 1950s, its polished metal body, the airline's outdated logo still visible on the fuselage. Even the spinning propellers seemed like relics from a different time. It was like a ghost had stepped out of history. The control tower scrambled into action, allowing the aircraft to land. As the plane taxied onto the tarmac, the ground crew, mechanics, and security personnel rushed forward, staring in absolute shock. Everything about the plane, its worn-out yet preserved exterior, the yellowed cockpit windows, seemed frozen in time. When the aircraft door finally opened, the first person to step out was Captain John Patterson himself, still dressed in his neatly pressed 1950s uniform. His face was pale with confusion as he glanced around at the unfamiliar airport, his eyes darting from the strange modern planes on the runway to the shocked faces of the ground crew. Behind him, the passengers slowly emerged, murmuring among themselves, their expressions a mixture of relief and disorientation. One of the flight attendants turned to Torres. Why are there so many people here? This isn't Miami. The authorities could barely comprehend what they were seeing. These weren't just survivors, they were untouched by time. The passengers, the crew, every single one of them looked exactly as they had in 1955. No one had aged a day. Their clothes, their luggage, their hairstyles, everything was an exact snapshot of an era long gone. Tension filled the air as airport security hesitated to approach. What was this? A hoax? A military experiment gone wrong? Or something else entirely? Something beyond human understanding? Captain Patterson turned to Torres, eyes narrowing. What's going on here? Why are you dressed like that? Torres took a deep breath. He had no idea how to answer. How do you tell someone that they've been missing for 37 years? And more importantly, where had they been all this time? Silence hung thick in the air as the passengers of Flight 914 stepped onto the tarmac, their expressions shifting from relief to bewilderment. Their eyes darted across the unfamiliar airport, lingering on the modern jetliners that towered over their small, propeller-driven Douglas DC-4. The ground crew, airport staff, and security officers stood frozen, unable to process what they were witnessing. Captain John Patterson's face darkened with suspicion. He turned to air traffic controller Manuel Torres, the only official who seemed to be addressing them directly. Where are we? Patterson's voice was firm, but laced with unease. This isn't Miami. Torres hesitated before answering. No, Captain. This is Caracas. Caracas, Venezuela. The crew and passengers exchanged confused glances, murmurs breaking out among them. Some clutched their luggage tighter, as if holding onto something familiar would anchor them in place. "That's impossible," Patterson muttered, his grip tightening on the flight manifest he still held. "We were on course. We should have been in Miami an hour ago." Torres swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had to say it. There was no way around it. "Captain," he began carefully, "I don't know how to explain this to you, but your Flight 914, disappeared from radar on July 2nd, 1955. He took a deep breath before delivering the impossible truth. That was 37 years ago. A gasp rippled through the group. Passengers shook their heads in disbelief, some laughing nervously as if it were a bad joke. One man, a businessman in a gray suit, scoffed. "Ridiculous. Is this some kind of prank?" A woman clutching her child's hand took a step back. 37 years? No, that's not true. Patterson's jaw tightened. "That's impossible. We haven't been flying for 37 years. We were in the air for a few hours at most." Torres turned to the airport officials beside him. He needed backup, but even they seemed lost, unsure of how to handle a situation that defied all logic. A security officer finally stepped forward. "We need to take you all inside for questioning," he said, his voice firm but careful. "You need medical evaluations, and we have to figure out what's going on." Patterson's eyes narrowed in distrust. He stepped in front of his passengers, shielding them. "We're not going anywhere until someone tells us what's really happening." Torres raised his hands in a calming gesture. "Captain, I promise you, we're trying to understand this as much as you are." Then something else happened. Something even stranger. One of the mechanics inspecting the plane let out a startled cry. "The clocks! Look at the cockpit clocks!" Torres rushed to the aircraft's open door and climbed inside. As he entered the cockpit, his breath caught in his throat. The dials, the flight instruments, everything was still functioning as if it were 1955. The fuel gauges showed the same levels as they would have during a short Miami-bound flight. The radio system had no modern frequencies. The pilot's logbook, sitting neatly on the dashboard, ended on July 2nd, 1955. But the strangest part was the clocks. Every timepiece on board, from the captain's wristwatch to the cockpit's instrument panel, showed the same time, 9:55 a.m., July 2nd, 1955. The exact moment Flight 914 had taken off. Yet, outside the aircraft, the world had moved on. It was now September 9th, 1992. Patterson saw Torres' reaction and stepped inside himself. His face paled. No, this doesn't make sense." He turned to his co-pilot. "Ronald, tell me you're seeing this." McGregor nodded slowly, his fingers tracing the edge of the outdated radio. "It's like we never left," he whispered. Then, something snapped inside the captain. He turned sharply to Torres and the security officers standing outside. His grip on reality was slipping, and fear was creeping in. "We're leaving," he declared. "What?" Torres frowned. "Captain, you can't just—" But Patterson was already moving. "Everyone back on board," he commanded his passengers. "Now." There was hesitation, but a strange, unseen force seemed to pull them back toward the aircraft. Whether it was fear of the unknown or the instinct to return to what felt safe, they obeyed. One by one, the passengers and crew climbed back inside the plane. "Captain Patterson," Torres called out, stepping forward. "You can't just take off. We need to." But as soon as Patterson reached the cockpit, the plane's engines roared to life. The security officers rushed forward, shouting for them to stop, but it was too late. The propellers spun faster, the wheels lifted from the ground, and before anyone could react, Flight 914 taxied down the runway at an impossible speed. Torres grabbed his radio. "Stop that plane. Block the runway." But no one could stop what was happening. With an ear-splitting roar, the Douglas DC-4 lifted into the sky, faster than it should have been able to. The ground crew watched in horror as it climbed higher and higher, and then, just as suddenly as it had arrived, it vanished. One blink, and it was gone. The sky was empty once more, as if Flight 914 had never been there. Torres stood in stunned silence, his radio still in his hand, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked at the other officials, the security officers, the mechanics, every single person who had just witnessed the impossible. No one said a word. Flight 914 had returned, and then it had disappeared again. The air over Caracas International Airport was still, yet heavy with something unexplainable. The ground crew, the officials, and the airport staff who had just witnessed Flight 914's return and its second disappearance stood frozen in place, unable to process what had just occurred. Manuel Torres felt his radio slip from his fingers and clatter against the floor, but he barely noticed. His heart was still hammering in his chest, his ears ringing with the roar of the aircraft's engines. But the plane was gone. Again. Just as suddenly as it had reappeared, it had vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but a gust of wind and a deep, sinking feeling in his gut. The security officers looked at one another, their expressions unreadable. A mechanic wiped his forehead with a trembling hand. No one spoke. What was there to say? Torres swallowed hard, trying to find a rational explanation. Could it have been an elaborate hoax? Some sort of classified government experiment? But how could all of the passengers and crew still look exactly as they had in 1955? How could the plane's instruments remain frozen in time? And, most importantly, where had they been for 37 years? The next few days were chaos. The Venezuelan government launched an internal investigation, but no official report was ever released. The United States was notified, but even their agencies, aviation authorities, military intelligence, and even NASA had no records, no explanations, no theories that made sense. Flight 914 had been lost over the Atlantic, declared gone forever. There was no protocol for a plane returning decades later, only to disappear once more. Yet, despite the lack of answers, whispers of the event spread like wildfire. Anonymous sources within the airport leaked information to journalists. The name Flight 914 began appearing in newspapers, radio broadcasts, and later, television specials. The world had questions, but no one had answers. The most haunting part? Some claimed that this wasn't the first time Flight 914 had been spotted. In the years following its initial disappearance, there had been unverified accounts, aviation reports, strange radar blips, and even personal testimonies of a ghost plane sighted in various parts of the world. An old, outdated Douglas DC-4, sometimes appearing on radars for a few moments before vanishing again. Pilots flying over the Atlantic had reported hearing strange distress calls from an unknown aircraft, its signal distorted, its pilot calling for clearance to land, only for the transmission to abruptly cut off. Some air traffic controllers swore they had seen fleeting glimpses of an old plane approaching their airspace, only for it to never arrive. But nothing had been as real, as tangible, as what had happened in Caracas in 1992. That had been different. And then just like that, the world moved on. The incident at Caracas International Airport became a legend, an unsolved mystery passed around by aviation enthusiasts, skeptics, and believers in the unexplained. The official records remained silent. No airline, no government, no aviation authority ever spoke publicly about Flight 914 again. As for Torres, he never forgot what he saw that day. He continued working at the airport for several years, but he was never quite the same. The memory of Flight 914's return haunted him, kept him up at night. And then, in 2001, nearly a decade after the Caracas incident, Torres received an unmarked envelope in the mail. There was no return address, no sender's name, just his name, neatly typed in black ink. Inside was a single item, a small, yellowed passenger ticket. It was dated July 2nd, 1955. The ticket was for Flight 914. His hands trembled as he turned it over. On the back, written in faded ink, was a message. "We are still flying." His breath caught in his throat. He could barely keep his grip on the ticket. He wanted to believe it was a cruel joke, a prank. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. Somewhere, somehow, Flight 914 was still out there. Still lost in time. Still searching for a place to land.